Welcome to True.
American Aviation in 1920, A Historical Overview, Introduction. The year 1920 marked a pivotal moment in American aviation history. Just 2 years after the end of World War I, the United States found itself at a crossroads between military aviation prowess and the dream of commercial flight. The nation's skies were beginning to open up, not just for barnstormers and military pilots, but for the first tentative steps toward passenger service and airmail delivery. This was an era of wood, fabric, and wire, when flying was as much about courage as it was about engineering. Chapter 1. The Dawn of the Aviation Age. The Post-War Landscape. When 1920 arrived, American aviation was in a state of transformation. The Great War had ended just over a year earlier, and thousands of trained pilots were returning home to a country that had no clear civilian role for their skills. The aircraft industry, which had ramped up production dramatically during the war, suddenly found itself with surplus planes and uncertain markets. The United States had entered World War I relatively late, in April 1917, but the conflict had accelerated American aviation development by years, perhaps decades. Before the war, aviation was largely the domain of experimenters and daredevils. By 1920, it had become a recognized technology with military and potential commercial applications. The American aircraft industry had grown from producing fewer than 100 planes per year before the war to manufacturing thousands annually by 1918. Companies like Curtiss Airplane and Motor Company, which had been small operations, became major industrial concerns. Glenn Curtiss himself had become one of the wealthiest men in aviation, having produced thousands of JN-4 Jenny trainers for the U.S. military. The regulatory environment. In 1920, aviation regulation in the United States was minimal and fragmented. The airmail service, operated by the Post Office Department, had its own rules for its pilots and aircraft. Military aviation fell under the jurisdiction of the Army Air Service, which had been established as part of the Signal Corps and would not gain independence for many years to come. There was no Federal Aviation Administration, no standardized pilot licensing, and no comprehensive safety regulations. Individual states sometimes passed their own aviation laws, creating a patchwork of regulations that varied widely from place to place. This regulatory vacuum would persist until the Air Commerce Act of 1926 began to establish federal oversight. Chapter 2. American Airfields and Airports in 1920. The concept of an airport. The term airport was barely used in 1920. Instead, Americans spoke of flying fields, aerodromes, or simply fields. These airfields were far removed from the concrete and steel structures we associate with airports today. Most were simply cleared patches of land, ideally flat and free of obstacles, where aircraft could take off and land. A typical flying field in 1920 consisted of open grassland, perhaps with a windsock to indicate wind direction, and maybe a hangar or two for storing aircraft. There were no paved runways. Aircraft of the era could operate from grass fields, and their relatively low landing speeds made this practical. The longest takeoff runs rarely exceeded a few hundred feet. Notable early airfields: Hazelhurst Field, Long Island, New York. Hazelhurst Field, located in Mineola, Long Island, was one of the busiest aviation centers in America during 1920. It had served as a military training facility during World War I and continued to be used for both military and civilian purposes afterward. The field hosted numerous aviation events and served as a base for experimental flights. The Long Island area was actually home to several important airfields during this period, including Roosevelt Field, originally called Hazelhurst Field No. 2, and Mitchell Field. This concentration of aviation activity made Long Island the epicenter of American aviation in the early 1920s. Bolling Field, Washington, D.C., established in 1917 and named after Colonel Raynal C. Bolling, the first high-ranking U.S. Army Air Service officer killed in World War I. Bolling Field served as a key military installation near the nation's capital. By 1920, it was the home of the Air Service headquarters and played a crucial role in military aviation development and experimentation. Crissy Field, San Francisco, California. Located on the northern tip of the San Francisco Peninsula, Crissy Field opened in 1919 and quickly became the primary military airfield for the western United States. Named after Major Dana H. Crissy, who died in a crash earlier that year, the field provided a strategic West Coast location for Army Air Service operations. Langley Field, Virginia. Langley Field, established in 1916, was named in honor of aviation pioneer Samuel Pierpont Langley. By 1920, it had become one of the Army Air Service's most important installations, serving as both an operational base and a center for tactical development. The field would later become associated with NASA's Langley Research Center. Airmail Fields, the U.S. Airmail Service, which began operations in 1918, created a network of emergency landing fields across the country. By 1920, regular airmail service connected New York and San Francisco via a route that required numerous stops for refueling and crew changes. These airmail fields were primitive by any standard. They typically consisted of a cleared rectangular field, approximately 2,000 feet long and 1,000 feet wide, with a small shed for emergency supplies and minimal shelter. Emergency landing fields were spaced approximately 30 miles apart along the airmail routes, the distance a pilot might glide if an engine failed at cruising altitude. Each field was marked with large symbols visible from the air, often painted on the roof of a building, or laid out in lime on the ground. At night, when night flying was attempted, rotating beacons were installed to guide pilots, though this system was still being developed in 1920. Commercial and private fields. Commercial aviation barely existed in 1920, but a few entrepreneurs were beginning to establish passenger services. Most operations used rented or purchased farmland converted into makeshift airfields. The financial model was uncertain. Few believed that carrying passengers by air could be profitable. One notable example was Curtis Field in Valley Stream, Long Island, which opened in 1919 and quickly became a hub for civilian flying activities. It hosted air races, served as a base for flying schools, and was used for early attempts at passenger service. Chapter 3: Aircraft of 1920, Military Surplus and the JN-4 Jenny. The most ubiquitous aircraft in American skies during 1920 was undoubtedly the Curtiss JN-4 Jenny. This biplane trainer had been produced in large numbers during World War I. Approximately 6,000 were built, and after the war, the government sold them as surplus for as little as $200 to $400 each. The Jenny was a two-seat biplane with a wingspan of about 43 feet and powered by a 90-horsepower Curtiss Ox 5 V8 engine. It could cruise at approximately 60 miles per hour and had a maximum speed of around 75 miles per hour. The aircraft was relatively forgiving to fly, making it ideal for training, barnstorming, and early commercial ventures. Specifications of the Curtiss JN-4. D. Wingspan 43 feet 7 inches. Length 27 feet 4 inches. Empty weight 1,580 pounds. Gross weight 2,130 pounds. Engine Curtiss Ox 5 90 GP. Maximum speed 75 miles per hour. Cruise speed 60 miles per hour. Range approximately 175 miles. Service ceiling 6,500 feet. De Havilland DH-4. The de Havilland DH-4, originally a British design, but built in large numbers in the United States during the war, was the primary aircraft used by the U.S. Airmail Service in 1920. The DH-4 was more robust and powerful than the Jenny, with a 400-horsepower Liberty engine that gave it a top speed of approximately 130 miles per hour. The DH-4 was a two-seater, but in airmail service, the front cockpit was converted to carry mail bags. Pilots sat in the rear cockpit, giving them limited forward visibility, a design flaw that contributed to numerous accidents. Despite its shortcomings, the DH-4 was reliable enough for the demanding work of carrying mail across the country in all weather conditions. Specifications of the DH-4. Wingspan 42 feet 5 inches. Length 29 feet 11 inches. Empty weight 2,391 pounds. Gross weight 3,557 pounds. Engine Liberty 12 400 GP. Maximum speed 130 miles per hour. Cruise speed 95 miles per hour. Range approximately 350 miles. Service ceiling 19,600 feet. Other notable aircraft, Standard J-1. The Standard J-1 was another trainer aircraft that saw service during World War I and was available as surplus in 1920. Similar to the Jenny, but less common, it served in barnstorming and flying schools across the country. Curtiss Oriole. The Curtiss Oriole represented an attempt to design a civilian aircraft from the ground up, rather than relying on military surplus. Introduced in 1919, it was one of the first aircraft designed specifically for passenger carrying. The Oriole could accommodate 3 passengers in an enclosed cabin, while the pilot sat in an open cockpit behind them. However, its high price limited its commercial success. Thomas Morse, S-4. This advanced scout trainer was used by the Army Air Service for training pursuit pilots. Though not as common as the Jenny, the S-4 was known for its aerobatic capabilities and continued to serve in training roles through the early 1920s. Aircraft construction. Understanding aircraft construction in 1920 helps explain both their capabilities and limitations. These were not the metal monoplanes that would dominate aviation within 2 decades. Instead, 1920s aircraft were built using techniques that dated back to the Wright brothers. The typical aircraft structure consisted of a wooden framework covered with fabric. The fuselage was usually built from spruce wood, chosen for its strength-to-weight ratio. Wings were constructed with wooden ribs and spars, then covered with cotton or linen fabric that was treated with dope, a cellulose-based lacquer that tightened and waterproofed the fabric while making it more resistant to wear. The biplane configuration, 2 wings stacked one above the other and connected by struts and wires, was nearly universal. This design provided structural strength while keeping weight relatively low. The wing bracing wires, which created a complex web between the wings, were critical structural elements. They had to be properly tensioned. Too loose, and the wings might flutter destructively. Too tight, and they could warp the wing structure. Engines were typically water-cooled V8 or V12 designs, with exposed valve mechanisms and minimal instrumentation. The Liberty engine, which powered many military and airmail aircraft, was a masterpiece of rapid wartime development, but it was also temperamental and required constant maintenance. Pilots learned to listen to their engines, detecting potential problems by subtle changes in sound that modern pilots would never notice. Chapter 4. Military Aviation in 1920, the Army Air Service. In 1920, the Army Air Service was still technically part of the Signal Corps, though it operated with considerable autonomy. The service had grown from a few hundred personnel and a handful of aircraft before World War I to a force of thousands of men and hundreds of aircraft by 1920, though demobilization had reduced these numbers significantly from their wartime peak. The primary mission of the Army Air Service was national defense, though exactly how aircraft would be used in future conflicts remained a matter of considerable debate. Some officers, like Brigadier General William "Billy" Mitchell, believed that aircraft represented a revolutionary weapon that would transform warfare. Others saw aviation as primarily useful for reconnaissance and observation, supporting ground forces. Key military bases: Kelly Field, San Antonio, Texas. Kelly Field, established in 1917, quickly became one of the most important training facilities for Army pilots. By 1920, it served as the primary flying training center for the Army Air Service. The warm weather and generally clear skies of South Texas made it an ideal location for year-round flight training. The field was named for Lieutenant George E. M. Kelly, the first U.S. military pilot to die in a crash, which occurred in 1911. Kelly Field would train thousands of military pilots over the decades and eventually evolve into Lackland Air Force Base. Brooks Field, San Antonio, Texas. Also located in San Antonio, Brooks Field served as an observation balloon training facility during World War I, but transitioned to other training missions by 1920. The concentration of aviation facilities in the San Antonio area made it a major center for Army Air Service operations. March Field, Riverside, California. March Field, named after 2nd Lieutenant Peyton C. March, Jr., who died in a 1918 flying accident in Texas, opened in 1918, and by 1920 served as a key West Coast installation. It hosted both operational and training units, and would play an important role in the development of military aviation tactics. Selfridge Field, Mount Clemens, Michigan. Established in 1917 and named after Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, the first person to die in an airplane crash as a passenger. He was flying with Orville Wright in 1908. Selfridge Field served as an important training and operational base in the upper Midwest. Military aviation doctrine and tactics. The Army Air Service in 1920 was still developing its doctrine and tactics. World War I had demonstrated that aircraft could perform reconnaissance, artillery spotting, ground attack, and aerial combat missions, but the relative importance and future development of each role remained uncertain. Pursuit aviation, what would later be called fighter aviation, had captured the public imagination through the exploits of aces like Eddie Rickenbacker, but the actual military value of aerial combat was debated. Observation aviation, which supported ground forces with reconnaissance and artillery spotting, was proven but unglamorous. Bombardment aviation existed but was in its infancy, with aircraft capable of carrying only small bomb loads over short distances. Billy Mitchell and other air power advocates argued that aviation represented a revolutionary technology that would make traditional armies and navies obsolete. They pushed for an independent air force and for development of large bomber aircraft. Conservative officers countered that aircraft were useful auxiliary weapons, but could not win wars independently. This debate would continue throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Naval aviation. The U.S. Navy also operated aircraft in 1920, though naval aviation was even less developed than the Army Air Service. The Navy had established its first air station at Pensacola, Florida in 1914, and by 1920 it operated several coastal air stations and seaplane facilities. Naval aircraft in 1920 were primarily seaplanes and flying boats designed to operate from water. The Navy was beginning to experiment with aircraft carriers. The USS Langley, converted from a collier, would be commissioned in 1922. But carrier aviation was still in the future. Naval aviation's primary missions were coastal patrol, fleet scouting, and submarine detection. Chapter 5. Commercial and Civilian Aviation. The Airmail Service. The most significant commercial aviation operation in America during 1920 was the U.S. Airmail Service, operated by the Post Office Department. This government service had been established in 1918, and by 1920 was attempting regular transcontinental airmail service. The airmail service operated along specific routes with intermediate stops for refueling and crew changes. Pilots flew converted DH-4 military aircraft, modified to carry mail in the front cockpit. The work was dangerous. The aircraft were operating at their limits, and pilots were expected to fly regardless of weather conditions. The service lost 31 pilots to crashes in its first 3 years of operation. Despite the dangers, the airmail service provided crucial proof that aviation could serve a practical commercial purpose. Mail could be delivered faster by air than by train, particularly over long distances. This speed advantage, combined with the publicity value of airmail, made the service politically and economically viable despite its costs. By 1920, the transcontinental route connected New York to San Francisco, with stops at Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Chicago, Omaha, North Platte, Nebraska, Cheyenne, Rawlins, Wyoming, Rock Springs, Wyoming, Salt Lake City, Elko, Nevada, and Reno. The entire journey could be completed in approximately 33 hours of flying time, spread over several days due to the limitations of daylight-only operations. Barnstorming and flying circuses. While the government pioneered airmail, private entrepreneurs found another way to make aviation pay: barnstorming. Barnstormers were pilots, often war veterans, who traveled the country giving flying exhibitions, selling rides, and performing aerobatics. The typical barnstormer would arrive in a small town, often landing in a farmer's field, hence barnstorming, and set up shop for a few days. For $5 or $10, a significant sum in 1920, townspeople could experience their first airplane ride, usually lasting 10 to 15 minutes. The pilot would take passengers up for brief flights over the town, allowing them to see their homes and businesses from the air. More elaborate operations formed flying circuses, which traveled with multiple aircraft and pilots, performing coordinated aerobatic displays and stunts. These shows included wing walking, aircraft-to-aircraft transfers, and other dangerous feats that captivated audiences. While sometimes dismissed as mere entertainment, barnstorming served an important purpose. It introduced millions of Americans to aviation and helped normalize the idea of flight. The dream of passenger service. A few visionary entrepreneurs attempted to establish passenger airline services in 1920, though with limited success. The technology was barely adequate, the economics uncertain, and public acceptance low. Who would pay significant sums to travel in a cold, noisy, uncomfortable aircraft that might crash? Aero Limited, operating between New York and Atlantic City, was one of several small operations attempting seasonal passenger service. These airlines typically operated only in good weather and carried only a handful of passengers. Tickets were expensive, often equivalent to a week's wages for an average worker, and the safety record was poor enough that some life insurance companies refused to cover passengers. The fundamental problem was that aircraft in 1920 were simply not well suited to passenger transport. They were small, uncomfortable, dangerous, and relatively slow. A passenger could often travel by train in comparable time with far greater comfort and safety. The closed cabin, which would make passenger aviation more comfortable, was still largely a future innovation. Passengers sat in open cockpits, exposed to wind, cold, and engine noise, wearing leather jackets, goggles, and helmets. Chapter 6: Safety and Challenges. Accident Rates. Aviation in 1920 was dangerous by any measure. Exact statistics are difficult to compile due to incomplete record-keeping, but airmail pilots faced approximately a 1 in 6 chance of dying in the line of duty over a several-year period. The dangers included mechanical failures. Aircraft engines were notoriously unreliable. The Liberty engine, despite being one of the better designs available, required overhaul every 50 to 75 hours of operation. Catastrophic engine failures were common, and since most aircraft had only one engine, such failures often resulted in forced landings. Structural failures, though less common, also occurred. Wings could break off in flight if overstressed or if the bracing wires failed. Weather. Pilots had minimal weather information and no way to avoid bad weather once aloft. They flew by visual reference to the ground, which meant flying below clouds, often below 1,000 feet. This brought them closer to terrain and made them more vulnerable to wind, turbulence, and reduced visibility. Icing was poorly understood and could quickly overwhelm an aircraft's ability to maintain altitude. Navigation. Navigation was entirely visual. Pilots followed landmarks, railroads, rivers, roads, and distinctive terrain features. Getting lost was a constant risk, particularly in bad weather or unfamiliar territory. At night, navigation was nearly impossible, which is why most flying occurred only during daylight hours. Human factors. Pilot fatigue, inadequate training, and poor judgment contributed to many accidents. There were no established procedures for most operations, no standardized training beyond basic flying skills, and no system for sharing lessons learned from accidents. Technical limitations. The aircraft of 1920 operated within narrow parameters. Their top speeds rarely exceeded 130 miles per hour, and cruise speeds were typically 60 to 100 miles per hour. Range was limited to a few hundred miles at most, requiring frequent refueling stops on long journeys. Service ceilings, the maximum altitude at which an aircraft could operate effectively, were typically below 20,000 feet and more commonly around 10,000 feet or less. The useful load, the weight an aircraft could carry beyond its own empty weight, was severely limited. A Jenny, for instance, could carry only about 550 pounds of payload, which had to include the pilot, passengers, fuel, and any cargo. This made economic operation nearly impossible. The aircraft spent most of its lifting capacity just carrying itself and its fuel. Flight instruments were primitive. A typical instrument panel in 1920 might include an airspeed indicator, altimeter, compass, and tachometer to measure engine RPM. There were no attitude indicators, no turn coordinators, no radios, and no way to fly safely in clouds or at night beyond the pilot's limited sensory perception. Chapter 7. Looking Forward from 1920, The Seeds of Change. Despite all the limitations and dangers, 1920 represented a moment of tremendous potential for American aviation. The infrastructure was primitive, the aircraft marginal, and the safety record poor, but the trajectory was clear. Aviation was here to stay. Several developments were already underway that would transform aviation in the coming years. Technological advancement. Aircraft designers were learning from experience. Metal construction would gradually replace wood and fabric. More powerful and reliable engines were in development. The closed cabin would make passenger flight more comfortable. Radio communication would improve safety and enable operations in poor weather. Regulatory framework. The need for federal regulation was becoming apparent. By 1926, the Air Commerce Act would establish federal oversight of aviation, including pilot licensing, aircraft certification, and airway development. This regulatory framework would provide the foundation for safe commercial aviation. Economic models. As engines became more powerful and aircraft larger, the economics of commercial aviation would improve. The Kelly Airmail Act of 1925 would transfer airmail service to private contractors, spurring the development of commercial airlines. Charles Lindbergh's 1927 transatlantic flight would capture the public imagination and demonstrate aviation's potential. The human element. Perhaps most importantly, 1920 represented a generation of pilots, mechanics, and aviation enthusiasts who believed in flight's potential and were willing to take extraordinary risks to advance the technology. These men and women, though aviation remained overwhelmingly male in 1920, created the foundation for the aviation industry that would emerge in subsequent decades. The barnstormers, who risked their lives entertaining crowds, were also teaching Americans that flight was possible, even practical. The airmail pilots who flew through storms and pushed the limits of their aircraft were demonstrating that aviation could serve commercial purposes. The military aviators who debated doctrine and tactics were laying the groundwork for air power that would prove decisive in future conflicts. Conclusion. American aviation in 1920 was simultaneously primitive and promising. The airports were grass fields with minimal facilities. The aircraft were fabric-covered biplanes that would seem impossibly fragile by modern standards. The safety record was poor, the economic viability uncertain, and the infrastructure barely existent. Yet this was also a year of extraordinary achievements and bold visions. The airmail service was proving that aviation could serve practical purposes. Barnstormers were introducing millions of Americans to flight. Military aviators were developing the doctrines and tactics that would shape air warfare for decades to come. And entrepreneurs and dreamers were laying the foundations for the commercial aviation industry. The airports of 1920, simple grass fields with a hangar or two, would evolve into the complex terminals and vast runway systems of today. The primitive biplanes that struggled to reach 75 miles per hour would be succeeded by sleek jets traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. The handful of pilots and aircraft of 1920 would multiply into a vast industry, carrying billions of passengers annually. But it all started with those grass fields, those fragile aircraft, and those brave pilots who believed that the sky was not a limit but a frontier to be explored and conquered. The year 1920 was not the beginning of aviation. The Wright brothers had flown 17 years earlier, but it was the beginning of aviation as a practical technology that would transform American society and the world. The legacy of 1920s aviation can be seen in every modern airport, every commercial airliner, every military aircraft that defends the nation. Those early pioneers, flying their wooden fabric machines from primitive grass fields, were building the foundation of the modern world. Their courage, innovation, and determination launched America into the air age, and aviation would never look back.